Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in the mountainous regions of North Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the spring of 1967, a graduate student from the University of Georgia named Malcolm Hendricks was conducting research in the basement archives of the Lumpkin County Courthouse in Dahlonega. He was compiling data on gold mining operations during the antebellum period for his thesis on economic patterns in the North Georgia mountains. What he discovered that afternoon would haunt him for the remainder of his life, though his findings would never see publication. The materials he uncovered were quietly reclassified, and by 1968, the entire collection had been moved to an undisclosed location during what officials described as routine preservation efforts. The documents that caught Hendricks' attention were bundled in deteriorating leather, tied with hemp rope that crumbled at his touch. Inside were ledgers, personal correspondence, and what appeared to be medical records from a mining operation owned by a man named Silas Wortham. The property was located approximately 7 miles northeast of Dahlonega, near the convergence of two tributaries that fed into the Chastity River. The land had changed hands multiple times since the 1840s, and by 1967 it was abandoned forest, marked only by collapsed mine shafts and the ruins of stone foundations. What made these documents unusual was not their age or condition, but rather a series of entries that began appearing in 1838 and continued with meticulous regularity until abruptly ceasing in late 1842. The entries referred to a woman identified only by a designation that appeared repeatedly. Libaboam, Yohor, or sometimes the French one. Wortham's correspondence with business associates in Savannah and Charleston contained references to her that were both clinical and disturbing in their detachment. The mining operations in Lumpkin County during this period were extensive but poorly documented. Unlike the larger plantations in the lowlands, these mountain enterprises operated with minimal oversight. The terrain itself provided natural isolation. Dense forest, steep ridges, and the constant sound of running water meant that what happened in these remote locations often went unrecorded, unwitnessed, and unquestioned. According to the ledgers, Veronique arrived at the Wortham property in March of 1838. Her origin was listed as New Orleans, purchased through an intermediary whose name appeared in the documents as J. Thibault. The price paid was unusually high, noted in the margins with what seemed to be surprise even by the man who had authorized the transaction. She was described as approximately 20 years of age, fluent in French and English, and possessing what one letter called uncommon physical grace unsuited to field labor. This last detail proved significant. Within weeks of her arrival, the ledgers showed that Veronique was assigned not to the washing operations along the river, where most enslaved workers processed ore, but to the mines themselves. This was highly irregular. The underground work was considered too dangerous and physically demanding for anyone but the strongest workers, and typically women were excluded entirely from shaft work. The correspondence from this period revealed that Silas Wortham was facing significant financial pressure. His mining claims were producing less than projected, and investors were losing patience. He had borrowed heavily to expand operations, including the purchase of specialized equipment from England and the hiring of a German engineer named Octavius Keller, who had experience with deep shaft mining in the Harz Mountains. Keller's arrival in late 1837 marked a shift in the operations methods. The original mines had been relatively shallow, following surface veins. Keller proposed digging deeper, following geological formations that he believed would lead to richer deposits. This required new techniques, including timbered shafts, ventilation systems, and the excavation of lateral tunnels at depths of up to 100 feet. It was into this expanding underground network that Veronique disappeared from the surface records. For nearly 4 years, her name appeared only in lists of rations distributed and occasional medical notations. She seemed to have become invisible, existing in the ledgers as little more than a numbered entry among mining supplies and equipment maintenance logs. What happened during those years remained unclear until Hendricks discovered a second set of documents, these ones never meant to be preserved. They were personal journals written in a mixture of English and German, belonging to Octavius Keller. The engineer had kept detailed technical drawings and observations about the mining operations, but interspersed among calculations and geological sketches were passages that suggested something deeply wrong was occurring beneath the Georgia earth. Keller wrote about sections of the mine that were restricted, accessible only by Wortham and himself. He described tunnels that extended far beyond what was necessary for ore extraction, chambers carved into the rock for purposes that had nothing to do with mining. In one entry from August 1839, he noted the installation of iron fixtures into the walls of a particular chamber, fixtures that he was ordered to design and install, but never explained. The specifications he drew showed mounting points, chains, and what appeared to be restraint systems. The journals indicated that Keller grew increasingly disturbed by what he witnessed. His entries became more cryptic, filled with biblical references and expressions of moral conflict. He wrote of sounds coming from the deeper tunnels, sounds that he could not reconcile with mining operations. He mentioned seeing Veronique being escorted into the shafts before dawn and not emerging until after dark, often appearing disoriented and unable to walk without assistance. By 1840, Keller's journal entries revealed that he had begun to piece together what was happening in the sealed chambers. Wortham had created a space beneath the ground where activities could occur completely hidden from any outside observation. The isolation was total. The tunnels descended into solid rock, beneath the water table, in spaces where sound did not carry and where no one would accidentally venture. The engineer wrote about confronting Wortham in the spring of 1841. The confrontation was not detailed, but its aftermath was clear. Keller noted that he had been forbidden from entering certain sections of the mine and that his movements were being watched. He expressed fear for his own safety and mentioned considering leaving the operation entirely, but worried about what might happen if he attempted to depart. Around this same time, the medical records took on a more frequent and troubling character. A local physician named Dr. Gideon Marsh was called to the property multiple times throughout 1841 and early 1842. His notes, written in the formal medical terminology of the period, documented treating a female patient for various injuries and ailments. The locations of these treatments were unusual. Rather than being seen at the main house or in slave quarters, the patient was examined in what Marsh's notes described as the lower works, or in the shaft house. The injuries recorded were consistent with prolonged physical confinement and labor in harsh conditions. Marsh noted abrasions, muscular atrophy, respiratory difficulties attributed to poor air quality, and what he termed melancholic exhaustion. He prescribed rest, improved nutrition, and exposure to sunlight. There was no indication these recommendations were followed. What emerged from these fragmented records was a picture of systematic isolation and exploitation occurring in a space designed to be invisible. The mine, which from the surface appeared to be a struggling but ordinary gold extraction operation, concealed something far darker in its depths. Veronique had been placed into an environment where she had no contact with the outside world, no witnesses to her treatment, and no possibility of escape or appeal. The question that haunted Hendricks, and which remained unanswered in all the documents he examined, was what exactly occurred in those sealed chambers. The records hinted at purposes beyond simple concealment. There were references to examinations, to tests of endurance, and to Wortham's belief that he was conducting what he called important observations that would prove valuable to scientific understanding. This last detail proved particularly chilling when cross-referenced with correspondence found in a separate bundle. Wortham had been in communication with individuals in Charleston and Philadelphia who identified themselves as physicians interested in racial science. The pseudoscientific theories of the era attempted to establish biological hierarchies, and there was apparently interest in studying individuals of mixed ancestry under controlled conditions. Veronique, described in one letter as being of mixed French and African parentage with unusual physical characteristics, was seen as a subject of research interest. The correspondent suggested that Wortham was providing detailed observations and measurements to these distant associates, who in turn offered suggestions for further study. The language used was clinical, detached, treating Veronique as an object of scientific curiosity rather than a human being. There were discussions of testing limits of endurance, documenting responses to various conditions, and maintaining detailed records that could be compiled into publishable findings. None of these findings were ever published. The correspondence ceased abruptly in late 1842, around the same time that the mining operation itself was abandoned. The reasons for the closure were not clearly documented. Financial failure seemed likely, as the mine had never produced the returns Wortham had promised his investors. But there were hints of other factors. A brief notice appeared in the Dahlonega newspaper in November 1842, stating that the Wortham Mining Company had suspended operations due to unforeseen difficulties. No details were provided. Property records showed that Silas Wortham sold the land at a significant loss in early 1843 and left Georgia entirely. His subsequent whereabouts were unknown. Octavius Keller's journal ended in October 1842. The final entries were brief and agitated. He wrote about a collapse in one of the deeper tunnels, about sections of the mine being deliberately sealed, and about his intention to leave the property as soon as arrangements could be made. The last entry simply read, "What has been done in the dark will remain in the dark. I cannot carry this knowledge." Keller's body was discovered 3 weeks later in the woods approximately 2 miles from the mining property. The official cause of death, recorded by Dr. Marsh, was listed as an accident. Keller had apparently fallen from a ridge and struck his head on rocks below. The circumstances were not investigated further. Veronique disappeared from all records after the autumn of 1842. Unlike other enslaved individuals whose sales or transfers were typically documented in some form, there was no record of what became of her. She simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. What remained were the sealed tunnels. When Malcolm Hendricks visited the site in the summer of 1967, he found the area still largely undisturbed. The main shaft entrance had been filled with debris, but the stone foundations of the surface buildings were still visible. He located what he believed to be the shaft house mentioned in Dr. Marsh's notes, a structure built into the hillside with walls of stacked stone still partially intact. Local residents, when asked about the old Wortham property, had little to say. The land had a reputation for being unstable, prone to sinkholes and collapses from the old mining tunnels beneath. People avoided it, not out of any specific knowledge of its history, but simply because it was dangerous ground. Stories existed about sounds coming from the earth, about sections of forest where vegetation grew strangely or not at all. But these were vague, folkloric warnings rather than specific accounts. Hendricks attempted to explore one of the accessible tunnel entrances, a lateral shaft that emerged from the hillside about 50 yards from the main foundations. He managed to proceed approximately 30 feet before the passage became too unstable to continue safely. Even in that brief penetration, he noted features that seemed inconsistent with mining operations. The tunnel walls showed evidence of careful shaping, smooth surfaces where one would expect rough excavation. There were niches carved into the rock, evenly spaced, purpose unknown. More disturbing were the markings, scratches in the stone, concentrated near the floor, repetitive patterns that could have been made by tools or by fingers. Some appeared to be attempts at letters or symbols, though degradation and mineral deposits made them impossible to read with certainty. Hendricks photographed what he could, but the images were underexposed and showed little detail when developed. He brought his findings to his thesis advisor, a respected historian at the university who had published extensively on antebellum Georgia. The advisor examined the documents and photographs with evident discomfort. After several days, he advised Hendricks to abandon this particular line of research and focus his thesis on more conventional economic analysis. When Hendricks protested, arguing that the materials represented significant historical evidence, the advisor became more direct. Some stories, he said, served no purpose in being told. The past could not be changed, and dredging up horrors that had long been buried helped no one. Hendricks refused to drop the matter. He began preparing an article for an academic journal, intending to at least document what he had discovered. In early 1968, while he was finalizing the manuscript, he received notice that the courthouse archives, where he had found the original documents, were being reorganized. When he returned to examine the materials again, he was told they had been transferred to state archives for preservation. Inquiries to the state archives produced no results. No record existed of receiving any such transfer. The photographs he had taken at the mine site vanished from his office at the university. Whether they were stolen or simply misplaced in the chaos of graduate student life, he could not say with certainty. His notes remained, but without the supporting documentation, they were simply his own recollections and interpretations. Not enough to publish, not enough to prove anything. Hendricks completed his thesis on a different topic and received his degree. He left academia shortly thereafter, taking a position with the State Forestry Service. He never returned to Dahlonega or to the questions that had consumed him during that spring of 1967. When asked about it years later, he would say only that some doors, once closed, should remain that way. The Wortham property remained abandoned. In 1971, the state purchased the land as part of a larger acquisition for watershed protection. Access was restricted, officially to prevent injuries from the unstable mining tunnels. Fencing was installed, though it was rudimentary and often in poor repair. The forest reclaimed the cleared areas, and within a decade, it became difficult to identify where buildings had once stood. In 1982, a consulting firm conducted geological surveys of the area as part of an environmental assessment. Their equipment detected significant void spaces beneath the surface, consistent with the known mining history. The surveyors noted anomalies in several locations, chambers and passages that seemed more extensive than typical mining excavations would require. They recommended against any development of the site due to subsidence risks. The report was filed and forgotten. Hikers occasionally wandered into the area despite the restrictions. Most found nothing of interest, just dense forest and difficult terrain. A few reported finding old stone walls or depressions in the ground that might have been building foundations. No one reported entering any of the old tunnels. If anyone did, they did not document it. The historical record of what occurred on the Wortham property between 1838 and 1842 remains incomplete and contested. No graves were ever identified on the site, though the acidic soil and dense root systems would have eliminated most traces of burials after more than a century. No human remains were ever discovered in the accessible portions of the mine tunnels, though most of the deeper sections were never explored. What can be established with certainty is that a woman identified as Veronique existed, that she was held on the property during the period in question, and that she disappeared from all records after the operation ceased. Beyond these facts, interpretation becomes speculation built on fragmentary evidence and disturbing implications. The correspondence about scientific observations and measurements existed. The medical records documenting injuries and treatment existed. The journal entries from Octavius Keller describing sealed chambers and restricted areas existed. Whether these elements combined into the picture that Hendricks believed they did, or whether they represented separate aspects of a brutal but more commonplace exploitation, cannot be definitively determined from the surviving evidence. The title attributed to Veronique in some of the documents, "The Beautiful Slave," appeared only in personal correspondence, never in official records. It suggested a particular kind of objectification, a reduction of a human being to physical characteristics deemed valuable by those who controlled her. Whether beauty made her situation worse or better is a question without a comfortable answer. It marked her as different, as worthy of particular attention, and that attention, in the context of absolute power and isolation, could manifest in ways that left no clear record. The sealed tunnels remained beneath the Georgia earth. Whatever occurred in those spaces went unwitnessed, except by those who could not speak freely and those who chose not to. The stone does not remember. The darkness keeps no record. What happened in the deep chambers of the Wortham mine exists now only in fragments, in hints, in the gaps between documented facts. In 1995, a sinkhole opened on the property, approximately 100 yards from the former main shaft location. State geologists inspected it and determined it was caused by the collapse of an old tunnel. While examining the hole, they noted what appeared to be worked stone at the bottom, squared corners that suggested human construction rather than natural cave formation. They recommended filling the sinkhole with gravel for safety. This was done within a week. No archaeological investigation was conducted, no excavation to determine what structures might lie beneath. The hole was simply filled, the surface graded, and within months vegetation had covered the area again. If something lay in the collapsed tunnel below, it remained there, under tons of rock and earth and the weight of years. The few researchers who have examined the surviving fragments of Wortham's papers have generally treated them as examples of the brutal realities of slavery in the antebellum South. They document exploitation, certainly, and the specific vulnerability of enslaved women to various forms of abuse. They show how isolation and absolute power created conditions where atrocities could occur without intervention or accountability. But there remains something in the specificity of these documents that resists easy categorization. The systematic nature of what was described, the technical language, the involvement of individuals claiming scientific purpose, these elements suggest something beyond opportunistic cruelty. They point toward organized, deliberate actions carried out over years in spaces specifically designed to hide them. The question of what exactly happened to Veronique in the tunnels beneath the Wortham property has no definitive answer. The evidence that might provide clarity lies sealed in collapsed chambers, buried under rockfalls, or lost to deliberate destruction of records. What remains are implications and shadows, fragments that suggest horror without fully revealing it. This ambiguity may be intentional. Those who created these situations understood the value of discretion, of maintaining just enough documentation for their own purposes while ensuring that no complete record existed that could be used against them. They operated in the gaps of oversight in spaces where conventional authority did not reach, and they left behind only enough evidence to hint at what occurred, never enough to prove it fully. The land where these events transpired looks unremarkable today. Forest covers the slopes, streams run clear through the valleys, and hikers pass through without awareness of what lies beneath their feet. The entrance to the old mines are collapsed or overgrown, invisible unless you know exactly where to look. The stone foundations have crumbled into the earth, distinguished from natural rock formations only by their right angles and regular spacing. In county records, the property is listed as protected watershed, access restricted, development prohibited. The Geological Survey's warning of unstable ground provides sufficient justification for keeping people away. Whether this serves to protect hikers from sinkholes or to protect secrets from discovery is a distinction that may not matter. The practical result is the same. The ground keeps what it holds. There are no markers, no memorials, nothing to indicate that a woman named Veronique spent years of her life in this place. Her existence is documented in ledgers and correspondence held in archives that may or may not still exist in records that were inconvenient enough to be quietly disappeared. She left no writing of her own, no testimony, no account of her experiences. She was rendered invisible in life and erased in death. The only trace that remains with any certainty is the mention in those few documents that survived, describing someone real who suffered in ways we can only partially reconstruct. The specific details of that suffering, the full extent of what was done in those sealed chambers, died with those who inflicted it and with the woman who endured it. The stone walls that witnessed it have long since collapsed or been deliberately sealed away. This is what remains: knowledge that it happened, uncertainty about the details, and the presence of ground that has never been fully explored. Somewhere beneath the forest floor of Lumpkin County, in collapsed tunnels and sealed chambers, physical evidence may still exist. Tools, fixtures, the infrastructure of whatever operations were conducted there, perhaps even remains. But the likelihood of anyone finding and documenting such evidence decreases with each passing year. The sinkholes that occasionally open serve as reminders that the old workings are still there, that the earth is hollow in places where it should be solid. When these holes appear, they are promptly filled. The official reasoning is safety, preventing injuries from unstable ground. Whether there are other motivations is a question that cannot be answered without evidence that is not available. Malcolm Hendricks died in 2003. His papers, such as they were not preserved. His notes about the Wortham documents were discarded by family members who saw no value in boxes of yellowed papers filled with handwritten observations about people long dead. If copies of the photographs he took existed, they were thrown away unexamined. Nothing remained to indicate that he had ever investigated the case, had ever tried to document what he had discovered. The academic advisor who had counseled him to abandon the research retired in the 1980s and died in 1991. He never published anything about the Wortham mining operation, never referenced it in his extensive work on antebellum Georgia. Whatever he knew or suspected went with him, unspoken and unrecorded. Dr. Gideon Marsh's medical records, the ones documenting his treatments of the unnamed female patient in the mineshaft house, have not been located by subsequent researchers. Parish records from the period show his practice existed and that he served the Dahlonega area, but his personal papers apparently did not survive. Whether they were lost to time or deliberately destroyed is unknown. The individuals in Charleston and Philadelphia who corresponded with Wortham about racial science and their interest in studying Veronique have not been identified. The letters reference institutions and professional affiliations, but the names were rendered illegible by water damage in the documents Hendricks examined. Modern attempts to identify who they might have been have produced only speculation. The theories and practices they advocated were not uncommon in that era, and many respected institutions were involved in such work. Narrowing it to specific individuals based on fragmentary evidence is not possible. What happened to Silas Wortham after he left Georgia has never been established. He vanished from public records, suggesting he either changed his name, left the country, or died shortly after the mining operation closed. No obituary has been found, no burial record, no subsequent property ownership. He simply ceased to exist in documented form, much like the woman he had held in the mountain tunnels. The story of Veronique, or what little can be reconstructed of it, stands as testimony to the ways in which power, isolation, and deliberate secrecy can create spaces where accountability vanishes. The specific horrors of what occurred in the Wortham mine may never be fully known, but the structures that enabled those horrors are well documented. The legal framework that allowed human beings to be property, the geographic isolation of mountain mining operations, the absence of oversight or intervention, the ease with which records could be destroyed or never created in the first place. These factors combined to create an environment where a woman could be taken underground, held in sealed chambers for years, subjected to treatment that left physical evidence requiring medical attention, and then simply erased from existence when the operation concluded. No one came looking for her, no one filed complaints or investigated her disappearance. She had no legal standing to resist, no allies with power to intervene, no mechanism to appeal to any authority. The earth that covered the Wortham tunnels continues to hold whatever evidence remains. Periodic collapses and sinkholes offer brief glimpses into the hollow spaces below, then are quickly filled and forgotten. The forest grows thick over the scars, roots penetrating deep into cracks and crevices, breaking down stone and timber, accelerating the collapse of whatever structures still stand in the darkness. In time, perhaps within another century, the tunnels will have collapsed entirely. The chambers will have filled with groundwater and sediment, and no trace will remain of what was built there or what occurred within. The rock will settle, the earth will be solid again, and the last physical evidence will be gone. Only the fragmentary records will remain, insufficient to prove what happened, adequate only to suggest and disturb. This is the nature of historical crimes, committed in secret. They leave enough trace to acknowledge their existence, rarely enough to provide complete understanding. We are left with fragments, with questions, with the knowledge that something terrible occurred, but uncertainty about the full extent. The gaps in the record are not accidental. They were designed into the system, built into the structures of power and control that made such acts possible. The title that appeared in those letters, The Beautiful Slave, represented a kind of marketing, a way of commodifying a human being for purposes that required particular characteristics. Beauty, in that context, was not a blessing but a curse, marking someone for attention that would manifest as exploitation. The title reduced a complex individual to a single attribute deemed valuable by those with power to act on that valuation. What Veronique thought, felt, hoped, or feared is not recorded. She left no testimony, no writing, no voice that survives in the historical record. She exists only as described by those who held power over her, filtered through their perspectives and purposes. This erasure of subjective experience is perhaps the final violence, the removal not just of freedom and dignity in life, but of voice and presence in history. The Wortham mine sits silent beneath the Georgia forest. Rain falls on the slopes, runs through the remaining tunnels, carries sediment into the sealed chambers. Tree roots penetrate cracks in stone walls, slowly prying them apart. Time and water and vegetation work to obliterate what human hands built, to erase the infrastructure of concealment and exploitation, but the knowledge remains. The fragmentary records, however incomplete, establish that this place existed, that these events occurred, that a woman identified as Veronique was held in circumstances that required medical treatment for injuries sustained in an operation characterized by isolation and secrecy. The gaps in documentation do not erase these facts. They highlight them, drawing attention to what was deliberately left unrecorded.